You never really get used to the quiet on the Eastern Front. That's the first thing you learn. It's not a peaceful quiet, not like back home on a Sunday morning. No, this quiet is heavy, thick. It presses down on your ears after days of constant rifle cracks and mortar thumps. It's a lying, deceptive quiet. You find yourself listening so hard your jaw aches, straining to hear over the thumping of your own heart. Your nerves, they get so frayed from the noise that the silence becomes its own kind of terror. That's when it would start, for me at least, a little not right in the pit of my gut, cold and hard like a stone. It wasn't a thought. It was an animal feeling, something deep down in the marrow of your bones telling you that things were too still, that the world was holding its breath, waiting for the hammer to fall. I was dug in near this little patch of woods. The name doesn't matter anymore. They all blur together after a while. The mud had finally frozen, which was a blessing. No more of that sucking, clinging filth that pulled the boots right off your feet. I was sharing a foxhole with Carl, good old Carl. We'd been together since basic, him from Hamburg, me from a little farm outside Cologne. We didn't talk much in those moments. There wasn't anything to say, but I could feel it from him too. I glanced over and he was staring out across the field, not really seeing anything, his fingers slowly tracing the grain of the stock on his rifle. He caught my eye, and we just looked at each other for a second. No words passed, but the message was clear as day. We both had that knot in our stomachs. He gave this tiny, almost invisible shake of his head, and I just nodded back. That was the whole conversation, something coming. And then it came. It started as a sound you felt more than heard, a faint, far-off shrieking, like 1,000 pieces of sheet metal being ripped apart all at once, way off on the horizon. Your blood goes cold in your veins. I'm telling you, it's an instant reaction. Your soul just shrinks. That sound, they called them Stalin's organs for a reason, and it was a damn good one. It was a chorus of demons, a metallic screaming that got louder and louder and louder until it wasn't just in your ears. It was inside your skull, vibrating your teeth. In a second, the single scream became 100, 1,000. The sky was full of them, a whole orchestra of freight trains coming right down on top of you. There was no incoming mail, warning like with artillery shells, no whistle you could track. This was different. This was the whole world deciding to end in your specific little patch of dirt. There was no time to think, no time to run for a bunker. All you could do was what the oldest instinct tells you to do, press yourself into the earth. You try to become one with the cold ground, make yourself as small as possible. You dig your fingers into the frozen mud, push your face into it, smell the damp soil and the roots. You give anything in that moment to be a mole, to just burrow down and disappear. You're screaming, but you can't even hear yourself because the world is nothing but this all-consuming, ear-splitting shriek. And then the first rockets hit. It's not an explosion. It's the planet breaking apart. The ground doesn't just shake. It writhes and bucks like a live animal trying to throw you off. It's a violence so complete it steals the air right out of your lungs. 1 second you're gasping, the next you're just empty, your diaphragm paralyzed by the sheer concussive force. Your brain stops working. There's no room for thought. No, oh God, I'm going to die. There's just pure animal sensation. The blasts come so fast they overlap, a continuous hammering doom. The pressure wave hits you in the chest, punches you over and over. You feel it in your bones. Dirt and rocks and God knows what rain down on your back, your helmet ringing like a bell being struck by a madman. This wasn't just high explosives. This was something else. The shrapnel from a Katyusha barrage, it wasn't neat metal fragments. It was the entire launch rack being torn to pieces, so you had jagged chunks of steel, red-hot and twisting, scything through the air alongside bits of wood from the crates, stones, frozen clods of earth. It was a whirlwind of death that cut through anything. A tree right next to our position, a big old pine, just vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was a shredded stump. If you were caught in the open, there was nothing left. Not even a body to bury. Just pink mist. I remember clenching my eyes shut so tight I saw stars. But the light from the explosions was so bright it burned red through my eyelids. The noise was absolute. It was a physical wall of sound that pushed you down, flattening you. You're not a soldier anymore. You're not a man with a name, with a home, with a girl waiting for you. You're a terrified animal, praying to a God you're not sure is listening, making promises you'll never keep if he'll just let you live through the next 10 seconds. Your whole universe shrinks to the few inches of dirt in front of your face and the overwhelming, obliterating chaos everywhere else. You hang on to that dirt like it's the only real thing left in the world. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stops. The last rocket impacts somewhere off in the distance, and the sound doesn't fade, it just vanishes. The silence that follows is almost as shocking as the barrage itself, but it's a different silence now. It's a ringing, hollow silence, broken by the awful, gut-wrenching sounds that come after. The screaming, not the metal scream of the rockets, but the high, thin, terrified screams of men. The cries for help, for their mothers, for a medic. The moaning of guys who are hurt bad and don't even have the breath left to scream. That's when the smell hits you. At first, it's just the acrid, bitter stink of cordite and burnt powder, so thick in the air you can taste it on your tongue, a metallic tang like you've been sucking on a penny. Underneath that is the smell of freshly turned earth, like a gigantic grave has been dug all around you. And then, underneath even that, comes the other smell, the one you never forget, a sweet, cloying, coppery smell. Blood. And something else, something worse, the smell of cooked meat. When the heat from the blast is so intense I can't even describe it. You never get that smell out of your nose. I slowly, painfully pushed myself up. My whole body was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shake. I was covered in a fine layer of powdered dirt and debris. I looked over at Carl. He was doing the same, his face pale as a sheet under the grime, his eyes wide with a shock that hadn't even begun to register. He spat out a mouthful of mud and just muttered, "Chase." That's all he could say, just chase. We crawled out of what was left of our hole and the world was unrecognizable. The landscape had been remade, craters everywhere overlapping, trees were just splintered toothpicks. There was a wagon, supplies just gone, shredded. And then you saw the men, or what was left of them. That fear, the terror of those few minutes, it never left you. It wormed its way inside you and took up residence. For the rest of the war, any sudden, loud, noisier truck backfiring, a dropped crate would make you flinch. Your heart would leap into your throat. You'd have that split second of pure, icy dread before your brain caught up and told you it wasn't the organs. It's been years, decades now. I have a family, a quiet life. But sometimes, if a train whistle blows in a certain way, or if a heavy truck goes by the house, just for a moment my heart stops. I'm right back there in the frozen mud with Carl, praying to become one with the earth. They had bigger guns, more accurate artillery, tanks that could wipe out a whole position. But nothing ever struck fear into our hearts like the screaming of Stalin's organs. It wasn't a weapon, it was a force of nature. It was the sound of hell itself opening up, and it's a sound that, once you've heard it, you carry with you for the rest of your life. That's the thing they don't tell you about war. It's not just the battles you fight on the field. It's the battles you fight inside your own head, long after the guns have fallen silent. That cold knot in my stomach, I still feel it sometimes. A ghost of a feeling from a ghost of a boy I used to be, a boy who just wanted to go home. You want to know what real fear is? It ain't the crack of a sniper's rifle or the thud of an 88 shell landing 100 yards away. You get a scare from those, sure, your heart jumps into your throat. But real fear, the kind that sinks down into your bones and makes a home there, that was the Katyusha. We called it Stalin's Organ, on account of the pipes on the launch truck looking like church pipes, but there was nothing holy about the sound it made. It was a scream, a tearing of the sky itself, and for a medic like me, it was a special kind of hell, because my job was to help, to fix, to save. And the Katyusha made that job a sick joke. Let me tell you about the day I learned that lesson, a day that started with a rare bit of quiet, a day I can still smell if I close my eyes. We'd been moving for what felt like weeks, falling back through the mud of another God-forsaken Russian village. The front was fluid, as the officers liked to say, which meant we were getting chewed up and spat out. My unit, what was left of it, had been in a scrap near a railway embankment, and we had our share of wounded. Nothing too bad, some shrapnel, a couple of bullet wounds, the usual price for a few yards of Russian dirt. Me and Fritz, my partner, we'd patched them up as best we could in a waterlogged foxhole, but they needed a proper dressing station. So when the order came to pull back to a consolidated line, we were relieved. We found a place about 1 kilometer behind the new front, a collective farm that was less shot up than most. There was a stone farmhouse, its roof still mostly on, and a barn that smelled of old hay and manure. It felt almost safe. That was the first mistake, letting yourself feel safe. We set up the aid post in the main room of the farmhouse. It was a strange feeling, having four walls around you after so long in a hole in the ground. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dried herbs hanging from the beams, a clean smell compared to the trench stink of cordite and decay. Sunlight came through a single grimy window, and for a moment it was just quiet. No artillery rumble, just the faint buzz of flies. Fritz and I started unpacking the medical kits, sorting the bandages, checking the morphine syrettes. It was a mundane task, but in that moment it felt like a piece of normalcy, a tiny slice of the world we'd left behind. Fritz, he was a Berliner, always had a joke, even when things were grim. A crumpled letter from his tunic, the paper soft from being read 100 times. "Listen to this," he said, a grin on his face. "My little sister, she writes that the neighbor's cat had kittens in my mother's best hat. Can you imagine? The old lady is furious, but the cat just looks at her like she's the one being unreasonable." We both laughed, a real laugh, the kind that felt foreign in your throat. For those few minutes we weren't medics in Russia. We were just two guys talking about home. I was thinking about my own brother, Karl, probably tinkering with his motorcycle back in Munich, completely unaware of what this was really like. That's the thing you hold on to, those small pictures from a life that feels a million miles away. I had a photo of him, grinning like a fool, and I could almost feel the weight of it in my breast pocket. That little farmhouse, with the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam and Fritz's laughter, it was a trap. It lulled you into thinking the war had forgotten this one little spot. Then the sky screamed. That's the only way to describe it. It wasn't a whistle or a roar like our own Nebelwerfers. This was a rising, shrieking chorus, like 100 freight trains tearing right over your head. The joke died on Fritz's lips. The sound hit you in the chest, a physical pressure that stole the air from your lungs. Your ears would ring with it, a high-pitched whine underneath the monstrous shrieking. We all froze for a second, a deer in Thelantons kind of freeze. Then the instinct took over. "Katyusha!" someone yelled, a voice cracked with pure terror. There was no bunker, no cellar, just this flimsy house. The wounded on their stretchers started to moan, their eyes wide. Fritz and I looked at each other, and without a word, we both dove under the heavy wooden table in the center of the room. It was a stupid, futile gesture, like trying to stop a flood with a teacup, but it was all we had. You press yourself into the dirt floor, you make yourself small, and you pray. You don't pray to live, not really, you just pray for it to be quick. Then the world ended. The first salvo landed maybe 200 yards away. The ground jumped. The window exploded inward, showering glass across the room. The whole house shook, and plaster rained down from the ceiling, covering everything in a fine white dust. Then another salvo, closer this time. The sound was deafening, a continuous hammering concussion that beat against your skull. Each impact was a thunderclap that sucked the air out of the room. You couldn't think, you could only feel the vibration in your teeth, the taste of dust and plaster on your tongue, the smell of high explosive and shattered stone. A piece of the roof beam came down, and the air went thick with splinters and debris. You just curled up tighter, waiting for the one with your name on it. It felt like it went on for an hour, but it was probably less than a minute. 60 seconds of pure, undiluted terror. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The screaming overhead ceased, leaving an eerie, ringing silence that was almost worse. Your ears were useless, filled with a high-pitched whine. You coughed, spitting out dust, and slowly, painfully, pushed yourself out from under the table. The room was a wreck. The wall facing the fields was gone, just a pile of rubble. Light streamed through the gaping hole, illuminating the dust hanging thick in the air. Fritz was next to me, his face a mask of white plaster, his eyes staring blankly. We were alive. For a moment, that was the only thought. Then the moaning started. It started as a low sound, rising through the ringing in my ears. It was the wounded we'd brought in, the ones who had been lying on their stretchers when the world fell apart. One man had a piece of shrapnel in his leg. Now a chunk of the ceiling had broken his arm. Another was just covered in dust, his eyes wide with a shock so profound he couldn't even form words. But they weren't the worst. The worst were the ones coming from outside. Through the gap where the wall had been, I saw them. Men, our comrades from the new front line, staggering towards us. They were like ghosts, covered head to toe in the grey-brown dust of the pulverized earth, their uniforms torn, their eyes wide and unseeing. Some were helping others a man with a bloody stump for a hand, supporting his buddy who was missing part of his jaw. Most just walked, stumbling towards the one place they thought might offer help. This was the wave of broken men. My medic training kicked in, that cold, clinical part of your brain that takes over when the rest of you wants to scream and run. Triage. It's a French word. It means to sort. You have to sort the living into 3 piles. Those who will live without immediate help, those who will die no matter what you do, and those you can save if you act now. It's the most terrible calculus imaginable. You look at a boy with his guts in his hands, his face pale as paper, and you have to walk past him. You have to, because over here is a man with a tourniquetable leg wound who might bleed out in minutes. You make a split-second decision based on a glance, and that decision is a death sentence for someone. Fritz was already moving, his hands surprisingly steady as he grabbed a bandage roll. I turned to the first man who stumbled through the rubble that was once our door. He was a lieutenant. I could see the insignia under the grime. He had a deep gash on his forehead, blood pouring down his face, but he was coherent. "Over there, Lieutenant," I said, pointing to a corner for the walking wounded. "Sit down, I'll be with you." He just nodded, a puppet with its strings cut. Then I saw the next one. A young soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, being half-carried by a big Feldwebel. The boy's entire left side was a mess of shredded uniform and flesh. The smell of blood was thick, coppery, and warm. The Feldwebel's eyes met mine, and he just shook his head slightly. "He's gone, Sanny," he grunted, his voice rough. "But this one," he gestured to another man leaning on him, who had a nasty but clean-looking wound in his shoulder. "This one might make it." I helped them lower the dying boy onto a stretcher. His breathing was a wet, ragged sound. There was nothing I could do for him. Nothing. I had to leave him. I turned to the man with the shoulder wound, my hands already pulling a bandage from my pouch. My hands were trembling. I'm not ashamed to admit it. They were shaking so badly I could barely tie a knot. The gauze slipped on the blood, my fingers fumbling. I could feel the soldier's eyes on me, wide with pain and fear. "It's all right, son," I heard myself say, my voice sounding far away. "Just a scratch will get you fixed up." I was lying. It was a hell of a lot more than a scratch, but you lie. You lie to them and you lie to yourself. Finally, I got the bandage tight, the pressure staunching the flow of blood. I gave him a shot of morphine and his eyes fluttered closed. One. I'd saved one. I moved to the next, a man screaming about his eyes. They were full of dirt and dust, scratched to hell. I poured precious water from my canteen over his face, washing the grit away. He blinked, his sight returning. He'd be okay. I turned back to the young boy on the stretcher. His ragged breathing had stopped. He was just gone. I hadn't even had a chance to learn his name. His face under the grime was smooth, unlined. He looked like my brother Carl. The same blonde hair, the same slight build. I felt a weight settle on my chest, a cold, heavy stone. I had to keep moving. There were more men. Fritz was working frantically, his face a grim mask. The floor of the farmhouse was slick with blood now, a dark, sticky pool that soaked into the dirt. The air was thick with the sounds of pain moans, whimpers, the occasional scream that was quickly stifled. And the smells, blood, sweat, the faint, sweet smell of torn intestines, and over it all the acrid stink of cordite and fear. At one point I was trying to hold a compress on a chest wound. The soldier, a veteran with old man eyes in a young face, grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Is it bad, Doc?" he whispered, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. I looked at the wound. It was bad. The lung was probably hit. "You'll be fine," I lied again, my voice hoarse. "Just hold still." He looked at me, and I saw that he knew I was lying, but he accepted it. He gave a tiny nod, closed his eyes, and his grip on my wrist loosened. I worked on him, my hands moving automatically, but my mind was elsewhere. It was on the farmhouse, the dust motes in the sunbeam, Fritz's joke about the cat. It felt like a lifetime ago. That piece was a lie. This, the blood, the death, the screaming sky, this was the truth. Later, much later, when the flow of wounded had slowed to a trickle and we had done all we could, the exhaustion hit. It was a physical weight, pulling at my limbs. My uniform was stiff with dried blood. My hands were stained red-brown under the nails. Fritz and I sat against what was left of a wall, passing a canteen of water back and forth. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We had saved some. We had lost more. We had to start the grim task of tagging the dead, collecting their dog tags. I walked over to the stretcher where the young boy who looked like my brother lay. I knelt down and reached for his tag. My fingers brushed his neck. It was cold. That's a feeling you never forget. The warmth of life gone, replaced by a waxy, terrible cold. I pulled the tag free, the metal cold in my palm. I wrote his name in my casualty book, just a name. But it was a whole life, a family somewhere in Germany who would get a telegram, and their world would end too. That's the scar the Katyusha leaves. It's not just the shrapnel or the concussions, it's the helplessness. As a medic, your whole reason for being there is to fight death, to push it back, even for just a little while. The Katyusha didn't just bring death, it brought it on such a scale, with such random, brutal fury, that it made your efforts seem pathetic, meaningless. It marked you. It showed you just how small you were. And the worst part, the dread that settled in your stomach afterwards, because you knew it wasn't over. The launchers were on trucks. They could fire and move. They could be reloaded. They could come back. Any time. The next hour, the next day. The scream could tear the sky open again. You de-jump at every distant rumble, your heart hammering in your chest. You'd look at the men around you, your buddies, joking or smoking or writing a letter, and you'd think, which of you will I have to leave behind next time? Which of you will I have to walk past? That fear, that constant, gnawing dread, was a poison. It was worse than the shelling itself. Because long after the last rocket had fallen, the Katyusha was still killing you, just slowly, from the inside out. And you prayed, not to God, because you weren't sure he was listening in this hell, but to anything, to nothing, that you'd never have to hear that sky scream again. I remember thinking I was a real soldier when I got off that truck, the mud of the Eastern Front clinging to my boots like glue. I was a replacement, fresh from training grounds back in Germany where the biggest threat was a sergeant's bark. We'd practiced with our Mausers, dug textbook-perfect trenches that would have made the manual proud, and I thought I knew what was coming. I had that arrogance, you know, the kind only the unblooded have. The veterans, the ones who'd been there since 41, they looked at me with these eyes, not contempt, but something worse. Pity. It was a deep, weary pity that I mistook for weakness. They'd try to tell me things, little warnings. Wait until the rain turns to iron. One of them, a guy named Klaus with a face like a worn-out saddle, said to me. I just nodded, thinking he was trying to scare the new guy. That night, before it all happened, I even wrote a letter home to my mother. I boasted about it. I said, "Don't worry, Mutter, I am finally where a man should be, and I will make you proud." I sealed that letter with such stupid, blind confidence. I might as well have been sealing my own innocence inside that envelope. The next afternoon, the air was thick and heavy, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. We were digging in a little deeper on the edge of this God-forsaken village, nothing but splintered wood and rubble. Then the air raid siren went off. It was a sound we'd heard before, usually meaning a few Stukas or maybe some Russian artillery spotting us. I just shrugged and started moving toward the trench, a routine drill. But then I saw the faces of the men around me. Klaus, the old sergeant, his face went grey. I mean literally grey, like old ash. It wasn't fear, not the jumpy kind I expected. It was a dreadful, cold recognition. Their movements weren't panicked. They were swift and grim, like men heading to a gallows they'd visited too many times. "Come on, boy," Klaus grunted at me, but I was still slow, still not understanding. And then it started. It didn't sound like any artillery I'd ever heard in training. Our guns, the German guns, they had a certain rhythm, a bang, wait, bang. This was different. It started as a distant, shrieking whine, like 1,000 tea kettles screaming at once, and then it built into this horrible, grinding chorus, a metallic roar that came from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of the sky being torn apart. It was a sound that didn't just hit your ears. It vibrated in your teeth. It rattled your bones. I stood there frozen, my feet rooted to the mud, trying to comprehend this nightmare symphony. That's when Klaus's hand clamped onto my arm. His grip was iron, the kind of strength that comes from pure survival instinct. He didn't ask. He yanked me off my feet and half-dragged, half threw me into the nearest trench, a deep, muddy gash in the earth that smelled of wet dirt and rot. And then the world ended. That's the only way to describe it. The first impacts weren't individual explosions. They were a single, continuous cataclysm. The ground didn't just shake, it convulsed. It bucked and heaved like a living animal trying to throw us off. Dirt and rock and shrapnel rained down on us, not in pieces, but in waves. The noise was absolute. It wasn't something you heard. It was something you became. My whole body was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremble that started deep in my gut. I was pressed against the muddy wall of the trench, my helmet jammed down so hard my ears hurt, and I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. I fumbled in my tunic pocket, my fingers numb and clumsy, and I pulled out the photograph of my mother. It was a silly, childish thing to do, but it was all I had. It was a small, faded picture of her smiling in her garden, a world away. I clutched that flimsy piece of paper like it was a holy relic, pressing it against my chest, ashamed of the gesture but utterly incapable of stopping. The air grew thick with dust, and the acrid, bitter smell of cordite, a taste like burnt metal coating my tongue. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the flashes of the explosions burned red through my eyelids. Next to me, Klaus was a rock. He wasn't even crouching fully. He was just leaning against the trench wall, smoking a cigarette as if he were waiting for a train. His calm was almost offensive. Through the deafening roar his voice cut through, flat and steady. "Keep your head down, boy. Just keep your head down. It's only noise. Only noise." I wanted to scream. The ground was eating us alive. How could it be only noise? But his voice was an anchor, the only solid thing in a universe that had dissolved into pure, screaming chaos. Time lost all meaning. A minute could have been an hour could have been a minute. There was only the now, the endless, punishing now of the bombardment. I prayed, I cursed, I promised God anything if he would just make it stop. I thought about my mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, anything to escape the reality that this trench was about to become my grave. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was louder and more terrifying than the bombardment itself. It was a ringing, hollow silence, broken only by the sound of dirt trickling down the trench walls and a faint, high-pitched whine in my ears. My body was still vibrating, a tuning fork struck by a giant's hammer. For a long time nobody moved. We just stayed there, pressed into the mud, waiting for the world to reassemble itself. Slowly, carefully, Klaus straightened up. He tapped my shoulder. "It's over, for now." His voice was hoarse. I uncurled myself, my muscles screaming in protest. My legs felt like jelly. I looked at the photograph in my hand. It was crumpled, smeared with mud and the sweat from my palm. I stuffed it back into my pocket, a secret shame. We started to climb out of the trench, each movement slow and deliberate. What I saw when I cleared the edge, I didn't recognize it. This wasn't the landscape I'd been in minutes before. This was the surface of the moon, a cratered, smoking hellscape. The trees were gone, replaced by splintered toothpicks. The farmhouse we'd used as a landmark was a pile of smoldering rubble. The air was thick with the smell of burnt powder, scorched earth, and something else, something sweet and metallic that I didn't want to identify. Men were beginning to stir, coughing, calling out names. And then I saw him. It was Klaus. He was a few yards away, lying face down in the mud. He must have been caught by the last salvo as he stood up. I stumbled over to him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sergeant," I said, my voice a pathetic croak. I rolled him over. There was no blood, no visible wound, just a fine trickle of blood from his nose and ears. The concussive force must have, I don't know. His eyes were open, staring at a sky he could no longer see. The cigarette he'd been smoking was still tucked behind his ear. That's what got me. That stupid, untouched cigarette. The man who had been a rock, who had saved my life with an iron grip and a steady voice, was gone, just like that. And in that moment, understanding washed over me. It wasn't a hot feeling, not anger or panic. It was cold, final, and absolute. It seeped into my bones like the mud I was kneeling in. This was it. This was what war truly was. It wasn't glory or honor or any of the nonsense they'd fed us. It was this random, indiscriminate annihilation. It was the scream of the Katyusha, a sound I would hear in my dreams for the next 50 years. It was the smell of cordite and death. It was the feel of mud and the sight of a good man lying broken in it. My arrogance, my boyish confidence, it all evaporated in that cold understanding. I was no longer a replacement. I was just another soldier, trying to survive until the next time the sky fell on us. The letter I'd written home felt like it belonged to another person, a fool who had died in that trench. I closed Klaus's eyes, took the cigarette from behind his ear, and put it in my pocket. I didn't know why. Maybe because it was the last piece of the man who had pulled me from the fire. And then I got up. I picked up my rifle. I looked at the cratered earth and the grey faces of the other survivors, and I knew I would never be young again. You want to know what got me through it? Not the rifle, not the lieutenant's orders, not even the guy next to me, though God knows he helped. No, it was this, just a rock. A smooth, grey river stone about the size of a mark coin. Sounds crazy, I know. An old man like me, still carrying around a pocket stone. But you didn't hear the Katyushas. You didn't see what they did. If you had, you'd understand why a man would cling to anything, anything at all, that felt solid. It started the day I left. The whole village was there at the station, a mess of tears and waving handkerchiefs, and that awful, shrill train whistle cutting through everything. My mother held me so tight I thought she'd break a rib, her face pressed into my uniform collar, her tears wet on my neck. My father, he just shook my hand, his grip like iron, his eyes saying everything his mouth couldn't. But it was my little sister, Anna, who surprised me. She was only 12, all skinny arms and big eyes. She didn't say a word, just pushed her way through the crowd, grabbed my hand, and pressed this little stone into my palm. Her hand was cold. She'd been clutching it the whole time, I guess. She looked up at me, her chin trembling, and said, "So you don't forget the feel of the river back home." Then she turned and ran back to my mother. I almost laughed. It was such a kid thing to do. But I closed my fingers around it, and it was cool and smooth. And for a second, I wasn't on that noisy, chaotic platform. I was down by the Oder, skipping stones with my cousins, the sun on my back. I shoved it deep into the left pocket of my tunic, and that's where it stayed. At first, it was just a superstition, a silly little secret. On the long marches into Poland, then later, when the real fighting started, my hand would find its way into that pocket. My thumb would rub that smooth surface, back and forth, while my boots crunched on the gravel roads. During sentry duty, staring out into the inky blackness, listening for the sound of a crawling Ivan, I'd be rolling it between my fingers inside my pocket. It was a connection, a tiny thread pulled taut all the way back to that riverbank. It was something from before. Everything else, the mud, the smell of damp wool and sweat, the taste of that awful black bread, the constant, low-grade fear sitting in your gut like a cold stone that was the now. But this little rock was a piece of before, and I guarded it like a dragon. Nobody knew about it, not even Klaus, my foxhole buddy. What would I say? "Hey, Klaus, I've got a magic rock from my sister that's gonna keep us safe." He'd have patted me on the head and told me I'd been in the sun too long. It was mine, private, a pact between me and the memory of my home. Then we learned about the new Russian weapon. At first, it was just rumors, whispers passed from a retreating unit to ours. They called it the Stalin's Organ, on account of the multiple launch rails that looked like the pipes of a church organ. But we soon had our own name for it, the Katyusha. It had a scream all its own. It wasn't like our artillery, the Nebelwerfer with its moaning cry we called the Stuka zu Fast, screaming Mimi. And it wasn't like the whistle of a regular shell you could sometimes track, sometimes guess where it might land. The Katyusha, it was a sound that came from everywhere at once. A metallic shrieking that tore the sky apart, a sound that got inside your skull and vibrated in your teeth. It was the sound of the world ending, and it went on and on because they weren't firing one shell, they were firing dozens, all at once. The first time I heard it, we were dug in near some godforsaken village outside of Orel. The air was quiet, just the buzzing of flies and the distant thump of the front. Then a sound like a train rushing off its tracks, high and terrible, growing until it was the only thing in the universe. You couldn't think, you just reacted. My hand dove into my left pocket before my brain even registered the command to move. My fingers closed around that stone, and I was pulling myself down into the mud, into the bottom of the trench, making myself as small as possible, while the world exploded above me. The ground didn't just shake, it convulsed. It was like being inside a drum that was being beaten by a giant. Dirt and rock and splintered trees rained down on us. The concussions hit your chest, knocked the wind out of you. The air turned thick with the smell of cordite and burnt earth and something else, something sweet and metallic that I later realized was the smell of vaporized metal and, well, other things. You'd hear men screaming, but the sound was muffled, far away, like you were underwater. And through it all, my entire world shrank down to the size of that little stone in my hand. I'd squeeze it so hard I'm surprised I didn't turn it to powder. My thumb would trace its smooth, oval shape, over and over, a tiny anchor in a sea of pure madness. All my fear, all my terror, I tried to pour it into that rock. I'd shut my eyes tight and think of Anna's face, of the cool, clear water, of the odor of my mother's kitchen smelling of fresh bread. I'd focus on the feel of that stone, the one solid, unchanging thing in a universe that was being ripped to pieces. It was my pocketful of courage. It was the only thing that kept me from just standing up and running, which would have been a death sentence. In those moments, that stone was the difference between being a soldier and being a corpse. It became a ritual, as precise as any drill. The moment that screaming started, my left hand would go to my pocket. It was a prayer, my own personal Hail Mary against the terror. I started to believe, with the kind of desperate, crazy logic that only a soldier under that kind of pressure can understand, that the stone was protecting me. It was a stupid, childish belief, but war makes children of us all. We all had our little rituals. Klaus would always tap the brim of his helmet 3 times. Eugen, a kid from Hamburg, would kiss a locket with his girl's picture. Me, I had my stone. And you didn't question it. You just did it. Because the one time you didn't, that's when you get it. There was one time outside of Kursk during that hellish summer. The heat was unbearable, the dust clogging your throat. The Ivans hit us with a Katyusha barrage at dawn, catching us half asleep. The world dissolved into that familiar nightmare of noise and fire. I was pressed against the forward wall of the trench, my face in the dirt, my hand clenched around my stone. I felt a sharp tug on my leg, a ripping sound, and then a searing heat across my thigh. When the barrage finally lifted, and the ringing in my ears subsided to a dull whine, I slowly got to my knees. My left trouser leg was torn open from the knee to the hip. A piece of shrapnel, still warm to the touch, had sliced right through the heavy wool and embedded itself in the dirt between my legs. It had missed my flesh by less than a centimeter. My leg was stinging from the heat of the metal, but I was unharmed. My hand was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, opened my fingers, and there the stone was safe and sound. A dark grey, almost black now from all the handling. I looked at that stone, then at the torn fabric of my trousers, and I knew it had protected me. That wasn't luck. That was the stone. That's what I believed, right down to my bones. From that day on, my superstition became an unshakable faith. The war ground on, a blur of frozen misery and burning towns. We retreated and retreated again. The faces in the trench changed. Klaus caught a piece of shrapnel from a mortar during a probing attack near the Dnieper. He was gone before we could even get a medic. Eugen froze to death on a night patrol one bitter January. We found him the next morning, curled up, a light dusting of snow on his back, his locket still clutched in his stiff hand. You learn not to get too close to the new replacements. They were just kids, their faces still soft, their eyes wide with a fear they didn't yet know how to hide. They'd last a week, maybe 2. It was easier not to learn their names. You just became numb to it. The only thing that mattered was the man on your left and the man on your right, and making it through the next minute, the next hour, the next barrage. The homesickness was a physical pain, a constant ache behind your breastbone. You dream of your mother's cooking, of a soft bed of silence. Real silence. Not this anxious quiet between shellings, but the deep, peaceful quiet of a country night. And through it all the stone was there. A constant. A tiny, hard piece of home that I carried with me. By the time the end came, we were a ragged, beaten bunch. We knew it was over. The news of the Führer's death filtered down, and it was like a spell had been broken. The fighting had a desperate, pointless feel to it. When the order finally came to surrender to the Americans, we just dropped our weapons. There was no fight left in us. I remember standing in a field, my hands on my head, watching the armies herd us into a makeshift pen. I was empty, just a shell. And my hand went to my pocket, out of habit more than anything else. The stone was still there. I felt its familiar shape, and a wave of emotion hit me so hard I almost stumbled. It was still there. I was still there. After all of its screams, the mud, the blood, the friend's last thigh's little piece of river rock from my sister was still with me. It had seen it all. It was darker now, polished smooth by thousands of anxious strokes of my thumb. It felt heavier, too, as if it had absorbed the weight of all those years. I never told anyone about it. Not during the long march to the POW camp, not during the years of rebuilding after I got back. What would I say? How could I explain that this insignificant little object was more important to my survival than my own rifle? It was a private thing, a pact between me and the memory of home, between the man I was and the boy I had been. It's sitting on the shelf right behind me, next to my reading glasses. I pick it up sometimes, when the house is quiet and the memories come creeping back. I hold it in my palm, my old, gnarled thumb tracing that same smooth surface, and I'm back there. I can smell the damp earth of the trench, taste the fear in the back of my throat, hear the faint buzzing before the storm. I feel the concussions in my chest, but I also feel that tiny point of calm, that anchor. It reminds me that I survived. It reminds me of the river and my sister's hand and a time before the world went mad. It's just a rock, but it's also everything. You want to know what real fear is? It ain't a bayonet charge, though that'll get your heart going, I'll tell you. It ain't a Stuka dive bomber, with that siren screaming down at you, though that's a special kind of hell. No, the thing that got deep inside you, that chewed on your nerves until there was nothing left, was the sound. A sound we didn't have a name for at first, just this screaming. We called it Stalin's organ later, because the launch racks looked like the pipes of a church organ, but there was nothing holy about it. That sound, it got into your bones. It made a pact with the fear already living in your gut, and together they just hollowed you out. But the strange thing, the thing you never hear about in the history books, was that it did something to both sides. It created a kind of unspoken truce, a brotherhood of terror between us and the Ivans. We were all just men in the ground, and that thing, that Katyusha, it was the real enemy. There were times, especially on the Eastern Front, when the fighting just stopped. Not officially, not like any kind of surrender, but just because everyone was too damn tired. It'd be deep winter, the cold so bitter it felt like a physical blow, and the front line would go quiet. Not a peaceful quiet, mind you. A heavy, waiting quiet. You'd be in your foxhole, your feet numb in your boots, trying to light a damp cigarette with fingers you couldn't feel, and you could hear things. You could hear a man coughing 3 holes down the line. You could hear the creak of the snow under a sentry's boots. And sometimes, if the wind was right, you could hear them. The Russians, just faint voices carried across no man's land. You couldn't make out words, just the tone. And it was the same tone as our voices. Tired, cold, a little desperate. On a few nights when it was so still you could hear your own heartbeat, one of our boys, maybe a guy who knew a few words of Russian from before the war, would cup his hands and shout something across the way. Not an insult, not a threat. Something stupid like, "Hey Ivan, you got a light." And sometimes a voice would shout back, just a blur of sound. And you'd know they were just like us. A bunch of kids and farmers and factory workers stuck in this frozen hell just trying to see the next sunrise. And in those moments, you didn't hate the man in the opposite hole. Your enemy was the cold, the hunger, the mud. And we all shared those enemies. You'd even develop a sense for the weather, a shared dread. A clear, cloudless night with a full moon, that was bad. That was artillery weather. Both sides knew it. You could feel the tension ratchet up, the joking would stop, everyone would get real quiet, like if we were still enough, the guards of war might forget we were there. Then it would come. It always started with a sound you felt more than heard, a low rumble from far behind their lines. But that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was what came next. A series of faint whooshes, like a train passing in the far distance. For a second, maybe 2, there was silence. And in that silence, your whole body would clench. You knew what was coming. Then it started. A faint whistling that grew and grew and grew, twisting into this insane, high-pitched scream, a sound that didn't seem like it could come from any machine, a sound like the sky itself was being torn in half. It was a multi-voiced scream, because the rockets didn't all land at once. They came in a wave, so the sound layered over itself, a chorus of pure insanity descending on you. You depress yourself into the dirt at the bottom of your hole, your hands clamped over your ears, but that sound, it didn't care. It vibrated right through the ground, through your skull. You'd taste the dirt in your mouth, smell the cold earth and your own sour fear, and then the impacts. The ground wouldn't just shake, it would jump and buck like a live animal. Dirt and rock and splintered wood would rain down on you. The concussions would punch the air from your lungs. There was no aiming, not really. It was just a massive area, a square kilometer of earth, being churned into a cratered moonscape. It wasn't trying to kill you specifically. It was trying to kill everything. And the craziest thing, the thing that really drove it home, was that from our positions, we could sometimes see their launch points. And after the screaming started, that entire area would also disappear under the same hellish cloud of fire, dirt, and shrapnel. Our artillery would answer, of course, pounding their positions. But the Katyusha, it felt different. It felt impersonal. Final. It was a weapon that showed no distinction. It didn't care if you were a hero or a coward, a general or a private. It just erased you. And in that moment, as the world ended around you, you understood that the Russian soldier in his hole was going through the exact same thing. He was hearing the same scream, feeling the same earth tremble, tasting the same terror. For those few minutes, we were all brothers in that particular hell. When the barrage finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. Your ears would be ringing so loud it was its own kind of noise, a high-pitched whine that blocked out everything else. But slowly other sounds would filter through. The moaning, the cries for a medic in German, in Russian, it didn't matter. The sound of pain is a universal language. The crackle of fires starting. The air would be thick with the smell of cordite and burnt wood and something else, something sweet and metallic that I don't like to think about too much. And the fighting, it would just stop. Not because of an order, but because no one had the will for it. Both sides were too stunned, too shattered. Men would be crawling out of holes that were half collapsed, their faces blank with shock, their eyes not seeing anything. And then something remarkable would happen, an unspoken agreement. You'd see figures, first from our side, then from theirs, cautiously standing up, not holding their rifles in a threatening way, but just moving slowly into the blasted landscape between the lines. They were looking for their friends, for the wounded, and we did the same. There was this temporary, fragile humanity that descended. A truce of terror. I saw a German lieutenant and a Russian sergeant, not 50 meters apart, both pulling a mangled body from a crater. They didn't look at each other, didn't acknowledge each other, but there was an understanding. For 10 minutes, maybe 20, we were just men, trying to salvage something from the carnage. The hatred was gone, replaced by a shared, hollow exhaustion. I was part of a patrol once, after a particularly bad barrage, and we captured a Russian soldier. He was just a kid, couldn't have been more than 18. He was hiding in a shell hole, shivering, his uniform in tatters. He didn't even raise his rifle when we found him. He just looked up at us with these huge, dark eyes. And in those eyes, I didn't see an enemy. I saw the same hollow, gut-wrenching fear that I knew was in my own eyes every time I looked in a shard of mirror. It was the Katyusha fear. It was a look that said, "I've heard the scream, and I am not the same." We gave him a cigarette, a piece of black bread. He nodded a quiet thanks. There was no need for words. We were both veterans of the same terrible storm. That's when we realized it. We stopped fearing the Russian soldier as much as we feared the weapon he commanded. Oh, don't get me wrong, Ivan was a tough fighter, fierce and relentless. But he was a man. You could outsmart a man, you could shoot a man, you could even, in a strange way, understand a man. But you couldn't outsmart that scream. You couldn't reason with it. It was a force of nature, like a tidal wave or an earthquake. It was a great equalizer in its horror. It didn't matter what uniform you wore, what ideology you followed. When those rockets fired, we were all just targets. The real enemy wasn't the man across the field. The real enemy was the scream from the sky, the impersonal machinery of annihilation that treated us all the same. In the end, huddled in our holes, waiting for the next wave, we were all just men, desperately hoping the screaming would pass us by this time, praying to any god that might be listening to let us live one more day, to let us feel the sun on our faces again, to let us go home. And I think, in some deep, unspoken part of our souls, we knew the Russians were praying for the exact same thing.